With the Winters saga over and Resident Evil moving into its next era, Grace represents a very deliberate shift in how Capcom wants this series to feel. If you enjoy deep Resident Evil lore breakdowns like this, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel. This video breaks down why Grace matters and why her introduction could change Resident Evil. Before we get into the video, I just want to say thank you for the support on this new channel. To give something back, I'm doing a small giveaway. On release day, February 27th, 2026, I'll be giving away a Resident Evil 9 game code or store voucher. To enter, just comment Resident Evil 9 below. I'll put all the names into a wheel spin and announce the winner on the 27th. And yes, your name can be entered more than once across different videos. Just keep it to one comment per video. The introduction of Grace Ashcroft in the files of Resident Evil Requiem represents the most significant shift in the series' philosophy of character design since its inception in 1996. For 30 years, the franchise has been built on the backs of super soldiers and elite law enforcement officers. Characters like Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Leon Scott Kennedy are essentially living weapons who have spent decades perfecting the art of the tactical kill and the narrow escape. Grace Ashcroft, however, is a 24-year-old FBI technical analyst. This distinction is the single most important factor in understanding why she changes everything for the franchise. Grace is not a field agent. She has never undergone the rigorous physical training required for the STARS or the DSO. She has never cleared a room with a tactical squad, and she has never been trained in the high-stakes ballistics and melee maneuvers that define the veteran cast. Her professional background is strictly rooted in cyber forensics, data decryption, and the clinical analysis of digital patterns. Grace is defined by a high level of intellect, but an intentionally low level of physical resilience. In a franchise where recent leads like Ethan Winters became tanky, regenerative juggernauts, Grace represents a glass cannon dynamic that pulls the series back toward its true survival horror roots. She is a civilian-trained officer, which makes her the most physically vulnerable protagonist in the history of the mainline series. Her skill set involves the use of forensic hardware and software to bypass security systems rather than using physical force to overcome obstacles. She cannot suplex an infected host, and she certainly cannot punch through a barricaded door. Instead, she must find the technical weakness in the city's infrastructure to proceed. This shift from military prowess to intellectual agency changes the fundamental power fantasy of the game. It is no longer about dominating the enemy through superior firepower. It is about outsmarting the environment and the pathogens that inhabit it before they can close the distance. The clinical reality of Grace's character is her total lack of combat muscle memory. This is reflected in the game's core mechanics through a significant amount of weapon sway and a slow, fumbling reload animation that demonstrates her lack of familiarity with firearms. When she is forced to use a weapon, it feels like a desperate last resort rather than a tactical choice. Her animations are jittery and her breathing is labored, showing the physical toll that fear takes on an untrained civilian. Grace represents the modern evolution of law enforcement, where the most significant threats are neutralized through information warfare and forensic audits, rather than ballistics. By centering the 30th anniversary experience on a technical expert who is genuinely terrified of her surroundings, Capcom is stripping away the player's sense of traditional empowerment to restore the primal fear of death. Because she is a technical analyst, her perspective on the Raccoon City ruins is entirely different from the veterans. While a character like Chris views a hallway as a tactical lane for engagement, Grace views it as a network of compromised data nodes. She is constantly searching for security bypasses, digital logs, and intercepted frequencies that can give her a tactical edge over a superior physical force. This emphasizes a solving over shooting methodology that redefines the survival horror loop. She represents the intellectual survivor, a character who realizes that the most dangerous weapon in a biohazard zone is a mind that can connect the dots before the monster even realizes she is in the room. Her inclusion is a requiem for the super soldier era, proving that the series is willing to return to its roots of fragility and dread to celebrate 3 decades of horror history. Her age, 24, also places her in a unique position as someone who grew up in the aftermath of the original 1998 incident, viewing the world of bioterrorism as a historical reality rather than a fictional nightmare. Part 2. The Alyssa Ashcroft Connection. Resident Evil Outbreak Legacy. The narrative logic of Grace Ashcroft is deeply anchored in her direct lineage to the 1998 Raccoon City incident through her mother, Alyssa Ashcroft. Alyssa was the tenacious investigative reporter from the Resident Evil Outbreak series, a character who survived the original disaster through her wits, her curiosity, and her specialized lockpicking skills. By making Grace the daughter of an outbreak survivor, the lore validates the experiences of the ordinary citizens who were caught in the crosshairs of the original Umbrella conspiracy. This connection bridges the gap between the cult classic spin-offs and the mainline series, without needing to rely on the big 4 legacy characters like Leon or Jill. Grace has inherited her mother's investigative spirit, but she applies it to the digital and militarized landscape of 2028 rather than the analog world of the 1990s. This lineage provides Grace with a personal stake that goes beyond a standard FBI assignment. She is not at the Wrenwood Hotel because of a government mandate. She is there because she discovered her mother's cold case files and realized that Alyssa was murdered to cover up the sterilization strategy. Grace is effectively finishing a 30-year-old investigation that her mother was silenced for. This turns the game into a personal requiem for her family's legacy. The skills she learned growing up under a survivor mother, a deep-seated paranoia, an obsession with detail, and a fundamental distrust of the global security apparatus, are the very things that keep her alive in the exclusion zone. It is a multi-generational war for the truth, placing the daughter of a reporter against the remains of a corporate and government syndicate that has spent decades refining its biological weapons. The clinical reality of this connection is the ancestral knowledge Grace brings to the table. Throughout the game, she uncovers her mother's old recordings and research notes, which act as a narrative and tactical guide for the player. This creates a haunting dialogue between the past and the present, as Grace walks the same ruined streets and visits the same hotels her mother did 30 years ago. The Ashcroft name is a symbol of the ordinary survivor who refuses to be silenced by the systems of control. By focusing on this specific family line, Capcom honors the 1998 roots of the franchise, while introducing a modern, tech-focused protagonist who can navigate the digital aftermath of the biohazard world. Grace is the living record of her mother's struggle, a character who proves that biological terror cannot erase the human drive for justice. Alyssa was known for being a master of unlocking, and while Grace doesn't use a physical lockpick as much, her ability to unlock digital encryption is a direct thematic evolution of her mother's gameplay style. Through Alyssa, Grace also connects new fans to the deep lore of the Raccoon City incident without requiring them to have played every single previous title. As she digs through her mother's files, she acts as an audience surrogate, learning about the original sin of Umbrella alongside the player. This makes the 30th anniversary title accessible, while rewarding veteran fans with deep cuts from the Outbreak era. The connection to Alyssa Ashcroft is not just an Easter egg, it is the structural foundation of the game's emotional stakes. It turns the sterilization strategy into a personal grievance, making Grace's journey through the hotel a mission of closure as much as it is a mission of survival. She is the requiem for her mother's voice, the forensic analyst who will finally lay the ghosts of 1998 to rest. This integration of the Outbreak timeline into the mainline series suggests that Capcom is finally ready to acknowledge that the ordinary citizens of Raccoon City were just as essential to the story as the STARS members. Part 3. Why a civilian protagonist matters after Ethan Winters. The return to a civilian protagonist in Resident Evil Requiem is a calculated response to the power creep that eventually affected Ethan Winters. While Ethan began his journey in Resident Evil 7 as a vulnerable everyman searching for his wife, his unique, regenerative biology eventually turned him into a biological juggernaut. By the events of Resident Evil Village, Ethan could survive catastrophic physical trauma and reattach limbs with a simple bottle of first aid fluid. While this was mechanically interesting, it eventually eroded the sense of fragility that is the primary engine of survival horror. Grace Ashcroft removes the plot armor of regeneration entirely. She is a standard human being with no biological enhancements and no supernatural resilience. If she is hit by a hunter or a biological weapon, the injury is permanent and terminal. This restoration of fragility is essential for the 30th anniversary. It forces the player back into a state of resource and risk management. Because Grace lacks a regenerative safety net, the environment itself becomes much more hostile. A single mistake in a narrow hotel hallway or a fumbled reload during a chase sequence can end the game instantly. This restores the engine of horror, which is the realization that you are fundamentally outmatched by your enemies. Grace represents a return to the roots of the early RE engine era, where the goal was to survive the night, not to go on a military offensive. This de-escalation of power makes every resource, from a single bullet to a forensic tool, feel vital. The player must adopt a mindset of avoidance and tactical retreat, which aligns perfectly with Grace's anxious and timid personality. The horror is effective because the consequences of failure are final, not something that can be fixed with a quick splash of green liquid. The clinical sorrow of this civilian approach is the total lack of a safety net. Grace is part of a generation that grew up in the shadow of bioterror, but she was never trained to fight it in the physical sense. When she is cornered at the Wrenwood Hotel, her options are limited by her human physiology. This fragility creates a deeper psychological bond with the player. You feel the weight of every step and the danger of every shadow, because you know Grace does not have the god mode of the Winters lineage. She is the requiem for the super soldier era, a protagonist who proves that the most terrifying nightmares are the ones where you are truly vulnerable. By stripping away the biological perks, the game centers the horror on the human experience of survival against impossible, militarized odds. It brings back the limited save and inventory Tetris anxiety that made the original games so legendary. Furthermore, Grace being a civilian in an FBI analyst role allows the story to explore the horror of the system. Unlike Chris or Leon, who are part of the elite defense network, Grace is a minor employee who realizes the people she works for might be the villains. This adds a layer of institutional paranoia to the survival. She isn't just running from monsters, she is running from her own employers. This shift in perspective makes her civilian status a narrative asset as much as a gameplay one. It highlights the gap between the people who make the bioweapons and the people who are caught in the crosshairs. Grace is the audience's window into a world where the heroes are tired and the organizations are rotting. Her vulnerability is her greatest strength as a horror protagonist, as it forces the player to engage with the world with a level of care and attention that has been missing for a decade. Part 4. The FBI Technical Analyst Role. Intelligence over Combat. The specific role of Grace Ashcroft as an FBI Technical Analyst is the primary engine for the mechanical evolution of Resident Evil Requiem. In previous entries, being a member of law enforcement meant you were a field agent trained in search and destroy tactics. Grace, however, represents the information warfare side of the Bureau. Her expertise is in cyber forensics, data decryption, and the analysis of digital infrastructure. In gameplay terms, this suggests a profound shift from shooting to solving. Grace does not access restricted areas by kicking down doors or using heavy explosives in the style of Chris Redfield. Instead, she utilizes her technical skills to rewire security keypads, bypass encrypted terminals, and recover blackmail data that can be used to manipulate the automated systems of the Wrenwood Hotel. This emphasis on intelligence over combat changes the fundamental power fantasy of the series. Instead of the thrill of landing a perfect headshot, the player experiences the satisfaction of outmaneuvering a superior physical force through technical mastery. Grace's primary tool is her high-tier laptop and her forensics kit, which she uses to audit her environment. This allows her to identify hidden traps, track the digital signatures of BSAA operatives, and even take control of remote surveillance cameras to scout the path ahead. It turns the entire game into a tactical puzzle, where the objective is to reach the goal without ever being detected. This category of stealth horror is a perfect fit for a character with zero combat training, as it reinforces her vulnerability while highlighting her unique professional strengths. Grace's intelligence becomes her shield, allowing her to stay one step ahead of the stalker enemies that hunt her through the hotel. The clinical reality of the analyst role is the management of data as a survival resource. In addition to traditional items like herbs and ammunition, Grace must manage her digital resources, such as encryption keys and server access. If she fails to decrypt a file correctly, or makes a mistake during a hacking sequence, she risks triggering a facility-wide alarm that brings the monsters directly to her location. This adds a layer of high-stakes tension to the puzzle segments that was absent in previous games. You aren't just moving blocks or rotating statues. You are performing a digital infiltration while a biological predator is breathing down your neck. It turns the quiet moments of the game into some of the most stressful encounters, as the player realizes that their mind is the only thing standing between them and a gruesome death. Intelligence also plays into how Grace interacts with the law. Because she is trained to find the truth hidden in data, she uncovers files and recordings that are much more detailed than the standard journals found in previous entries. She can reconstruct deleted emails, listen to intercepted audio logs, and view recovered security footage to piece together the 30-year history of the sterilization strategy. This makes her the perfect vessel for a 30th anniversary title, as her professional skill set is literally designed to perform a historical audit of the franchise. Grace is not just a survivor, she is a clinical historian of the apocalypse. Her journey through the Wrenwood Hotel is a mission to declassify the secrets that the global security apparatus has spent decades trying to hide. This role allows the player to feel like an active participant in uncovering the conspiracy rather than just a witness to it. Part 5. Grace's personality. Shy, timid, and easily frightened. The personality of Grace Ashcroft is designed to be the antithesis of the stoic and quip-heavy protagonists that have defined Resident Evil for the last 15 years. Unlike the confident and often angry Ethan Winters, or the legendary Leon Kennedy, Grace is portrayed as shy, timid, and easily frightened. She is an introvert who is more comfortable with data than with people, and her reaction to the biological horrors of Raccoon City is one of genuine, unfiltered panic. This personality type is a deliberate choice by the developers to align the player more closely with the character's fear. When a monster lunges out of the shadows and the player jumps in their seat, Grace is also screaming and gasping for air. This removes the character dissonance that often occurs in horror games where the player is terrified, but the character on screen remains calm and professional. This vulnerability in her personality allows for a more reactive category of horror. Grace's dialogue reflects her anxiety and her lack of confidence in her own survival. She often mumbles to herself to stay focused or whimpers when she is hiding in a closet from a stalker enemy. This makes her feel like a real human being caught in an impossible situation, rather than a superhero who is just doing their job. Her high intellect is her shield, but her low physical resilience is her constant reminder of her mortality. By making Grace easily frightened, Capcom is forcing the player to care about her in a way that is different from previous heroes. You don't just want to win the game. You want to protect Grace from the trauma that is being inflicted upon her. Her timid nature makes her small victories feel monumental, as every step forward is a triumph over her own internal panic. The clinical reality of this personality type is that it justifies specific gameplay mechanics that enhance the horror. Grace's anxiety meter, or panic state, could influence things like weapon sway, the speed of her reloads, and her ability to perform complex technical tasks. If she is in a state of total panic, her hands might shake, making it harder to input a security code or steady a flashlight. This creates a physical manifestation of her fear that the player must manage through breathing exercises or finding safe zones. It turns the character's personality into a central pillar of the survival strategy. You aren't just managing your health and your ammo. You are managing the mental state of a character who was never meant to be a hero. This psychological layer adds a depth to the survival horror that moves beyond simple inventory management. Furthermore, Grace's personality allows for a profound growth arc throughout the game. By starting the story as a timid analyst who is terrified of her own shadow, her eventual acts of bravery feel much more significant and earned. When she finally stands up to a major antagonist or solves a high-stakes puzzle under pressure, it represents a genuine victory of the human spirit over biological terror. She is the requiem for the action hero, a character who proves that being a hero is not about a lack of fear, but about doing what is necessary despite it. Grace's journey through the Renwood Hotel is as much a psychological trial as it is a physical one. Her personality is the soul of Resident Evil Requiem, a reminder that the most terrifying nightmares are the ones we face when we feel truly alone and unprepared. This ordinary nature makes her survival more inspiring than that of a trained super soldier. Part 6. The trauma factor, witnessing her mother's murder. The core motivation that drives Grace Ashcroft into the heart of the Raccoon City ruins is a deep and unresolved trauma factor. At a young age, Grace witnessed the murder of her mother, Alyssa Ashcroft, an event that has defined her entire adult life and led her to join the FBI in the first place. Alyssa's death was not a random act of violence. It was a targeted assassination, likely tied to a story she was investigating regarding the BSAA corruption or a leftover umbrella syndicate. This trauma makes Grace's journey to the Wrenwood Hotel deeply personal rather than professional. She isn't there because of a government mandate. She is there because she found her mother's cold case files and realized that the answers she has been seeking for 20 years are hidden in the radioactive fog of her mother's final investigation. This revenge versus fear, internal conflict, is what provides the narrative weight to Resident Evil Requiem. Grace is terrified of the monsters and the organizations she is investigating, but her desire for closure and justice for her mother is the only thing that keeps her moving forward. This trauma is a clinical driver that justifies her reckless decision to enter an exclusion zone without backup or high-tier weapons. She is a character who is broken by the past, and her mission is a desperate attempt to fix the pieces. This makes her journey much more emotionally resonant than a standard military operation. The Wrenwood Hotel is not just a building to Grace. It is a graveyard where her mother's voice still echoes through the recovered data logs and the shadows of the past. Her trauma is the bridge between the horror of 1998 and the horror of 2028. The clinical reality of this trauma is how it manifests in the environment and the storytelling. Grace often experiences flashbacks or auditory hallucinations when she enters specific areas of the hotel that were significant to her mother's final days. This adds a psychological layer to the horror, as the player is never quite sure if what they are seeing is a biological reality or a manifestation of Grace's grief. It turns the sterilization strategy into something more than just a biological threat. It is a conspiracy that destroyed a family. Grace's journey is an attempt to reclaim her lineage from the people who tried to erase it. This personal stake raises the tension to terminal levels, as the player realizes that if Grace fails, the truth about Alyssa Ashcroft will be lost forever. The trauma factor ensures that the player is invested in the why of the story, not just the how of surviving it. Furthermore, the trauma factor allows for a unique connection between Grace and the primary antagonist, Dr. Victor Gideon. Gideon is likely the one who ordered or facilitated the removal of Alyssa Ashcroft 30 years ago, making the conflict in Resident Evil Requiem a multi-generational war. This creates a cat and mouse dynamic, where Gideon views Grace as a loose end that needs to be tied, while Grace views Gideon as the monster who stole her future. It turns the 30th anniversary into a final reckoning for the Ashcroft family. Grace is the requiem for her mother's voice, the one who will finally speak the truth that was silenced in the 1990s. Her trauma is her burden, but it is also the source of her incredible intellectual resolve. She is the girl who saw the darkness and decided to shine a light on it, no matter the cost. This makes her victory, if achieved, a profound statement of justice in a world that has largely forgotten what that word means. Part 7. How Grace breaks the super soldier protagonist pattern. The evolution of the Resident Evil protagonist has, for the last 15 years, followed a trajectory of increasing lethality and combat specialization. From the high-octane action of Resident Evil 4 through the global warfare of Resident Evil 6, and even into the heavy military focus of the Chris Redfield segments in Resident Evil 8, the player has been conditioned to occupy the role of a weapon. These characters are defined by their ability to neutralize threats with surgical precision, often utilizing superhuman physical feats like boulder punching or tactical suplexes to dominate the biological organic weapons they face. Grace Ashcroft breaks this established pattern by existing as a glass cannon. She is a character who possesses an incredible intellectual capacity, but a dangerously low physical resilience. She cannot rely on the brute force tactics of the previous generation, because her physiology simply will not support it. This shift forces the game design to return to the foundational principles of avoidance and resource management rather than assault. Grace's lack of combat training means that the super soldier power fantasy is completely absent from her gameplay loop. In previous entries, the player felt a sense of empowerment when encountering a standard zombie or a molded creature, because the protagonist possessed the tools to dismantle that threat. With Grace, the power fantasy is replaced by a survival anxiety. When she encounters a biological threat, her first instinct is not to engage, but to find a way to circumvent the danger. This breaks the pattern of the series being an action horror experience and returns it to the realm of pure survival. The game design must accommodate this by providing Grace with more environmental options, such as hiding spots, distraction tools, and technical bypasses. This forces the player to slow down and think critically about every room transition, as they know that Grace cannot fight her way out of a corner if things go wrong. The clinical reality of breaking this pattern is the reintroduction of the avoidance loop. In the military-focused entries, combat was the primary solution to every problem. In Resident Evil Requiem, combat is a sign of failure for a character like Grace. If she is forced to fire her weapon, it means her stealth and her technical planning have broken down. This creates a much more tense and methodical pacing. The game rewards the player for finding a digital way to lock a monster behind a security door, rather than spending precious ammunition to kill it. This change in philosophy makes the biological threats feel much more intimidating. A single hunter or licker is no longer a target to be farmed for items. It is a lethal predator that Grace must respect. This de-escalation of player power is a requiem for the action hero era, proving that the most terrifying experiences are the ones where you are fundamentally outmatched. Furthermore, Grace's deviation from the super soldier pattern allows for a more adult category of horror. The heroes of the past were often seen as untouchable icons who could overcome any obstacle through sheer will and training. Grace is a human being who is visibly affected by the trauma and the physical strain of her situation. Her hands shake, her aim is inconsistent, and her movements are fumbled when her panic level is high. This grounded approach makes the 30th anniversary experience feel more like a real-world disaster than a comic book adventure. It forces the audience to confront the reality of what a biological outbreak would actually be like for someone who isn't a trained killer. By breaking the super soldier pattern, Capcom has successfully restored the soul of survival horror, reminding the world that the genre is at its best when the odds are stacked against a character who is just trying to survive the night. Part 8. The Return of Vulnerability in Survival Horror. Vulnerability is the engine of horror, and Grace Ashcroft is the most vulnerable protagonist the series has seen in decades. In the world of Resident Evil Requiem, this vulnerability is not just a narrative theme. It is a clinical gameplay mechanic that dictates every decision the player makes. Because Grace is a 24-year-old analyst with no combat training and no biological enhancements, the world of the Wrenwood Hotel is infinitely more dangerous for her than it would be for a veteran like Leon. This return to vulnerability is a direct response to the power creep that had begun to sanitize the fear in previous entries. When the player knows they can just dodge or parry their way out of any situation, the sense of dread evaporates. Grace removes those safety nets, forcing the player to confront the reality that a single mistake can lead to a gruesome and terminal end. The clinical reality of this vulnerability is the threat scaling of the enemies. In the era of super soldiers, a standard zombie was a minor nuisance. In Resident Evil Requiem, even the most basic infected host is a significant threat to Grace. She lacks the physical strength to push enemies away with ease, and her struggle mechanics are much more desperate and costly in terms of health and stamina. This makes the environment itself feel hostile again. The player becomes hyper-aware of every sound and every movement in the fog, because they know that Grace cannot brute force her way through a crowd. This vulnerability also extends to the stalker enemies, like the shadow operatives and the unique mutations created by Dr. Victor Gideon. For Grace, these are not just enemies to be fought. They are nightmares that must be avoided at all costs. This return to vulnerability also influences the atmospheric density of the game. Because the player is constantly on the defensive, they spend more time observing the environment. The detailed rendering of the Raccoon City ruins becomes much more impactful when you are moving through them slowly and cautiously. The vulnerability creates a sauna of tension, where the player is constantly looking for a way to stay out of sight. This is where the 30th anniversary truly shines, as it recaptures the feeling of the original 1996 mansion. You are alone, you are weak, and you are trapped in a place that wants to kill you. Grace's fragility is the requiem for the player's confidence, a reminder that the most effective horror comes from the realization that you are not in control of the situation. Furthermore, the vulnerability of Grace Ashcroft allows for a deeper engagement with the crafting and survival systems. When every bullet counts and every hit is potentially fatal, the management of resources becomes a life or death puzzle. Grace must use her forensics kit to synthesize solutions and antidotes from the environment, because she cannot rely on finding crates of military-grade ammunition. This turns the business of survival into a methodical and clinical process. You aren't just playing a game, you are managing the life of a character who is on the edge of collapse. This return to vulnerability proves that the franchise does not need bigger monsters to be more terrifying. It just needs a protagonist who can actually be killed by them. Grace is the definitive survivor for the era of the aftermath, a character who proves that fear is a rational response to a world that has been turned into a biological graveyard. Part 9. Grace versus Leon. The dual protagonist dynamic. The dual protagonist dynamic in Resident Evil Requiem, assuming the secondary lead is the veteran Leon Scott Kennedy, creates a fascinating brain versus brawn contrast that defines the 30th anniversary experience. This dynamic highlights the massive gap between the old guard and the new blood. Leon is the tired veteran who has spent 30 years seeing monsters as tactical targets to be neutralized. To him, the ruins of Raccoon City are a familiar battlefield. Grace, however, is the terrified rookie who sees these same creatures as psychological nightmares. This creates a unique friction in the storytelling and the gameplay. While Leon handles the high-tier boss encounters and the heavy combat segments, Grace handles the deep investigation, the forensic puzzles, and the stealth segments. They are two different sides of the same survival coin. This dynamic emphasizes the protector role that Leon occupies for Grace. He is the one who provides the tactical cover and the physical strength required to navigate the most dangerous zones of the city. However, the the game is careful not to make Grace a damsel in distress. While Leon provides the brawn, Grace provides the brain that Leon lacks. She is the one who can access the encrypted data nodes and uncover the truth behind the sterilization strategy that Leon's guns cannot reach. This creates a mutual dependency that is essential for the narrative. Leon can keep Grace alive, but only Grace can find the evidence needed to stop the conspiracy. This highlights the theme of generational cooperation, showing that the veterans need the technical expertise of the youth just as much as the youth need the survival skills of the veterans. The reality of this dynamic is the perspective shift for the player. When playing as Leon, the game feels like a tactical thriller, where you are managing your ammunition and your combat maneuvers. When playing as Grace, the game shifts into a psychological horror, where you are managing your panic and your digital resources. This contrast ensures that the gameplay remains fresh throughout the entire campaign. It allows the player to experience the 30th anniversary from two completely different perspectives, honoring the series' history as both a tactical action series and a survival horror series. The Grace versus Leon dynamic is a requiem for the single protagonist model, proving that the best stories are the ones told through the friction between experience and innocence. Furthermore, the dynamic allows for a deeper exploration of the trauma of the veterans. Through his interactions with Grace, we see a more human side of Leon. He sees in her the innocence that he lost 30 years ago in the same city. This adds a layer of emotional weight to his character that has been missing in his more recent super agent appearances. He isn't just a soldier. He is a man trying to ensure that Grace doesn't end up as broken as he is. Grace, in turn, views Leon with a mixture of awe and pity. She sees the physical toll that 3 decades of biological war has taken on him, and she realizes that the hero status she once admired is actually a life of permanent trauma. This dual perspective is the soul of Resident Evil Requiem, providing a clinical and moving look at the cost of being a survivor in the world of the aftermath. Part 10. Why Grace's inexperience is a gameplay asset. In the world of survival horror, a protagonist's experience can often be a liability to the fear factor. When a character is too skilled, the player feels too safe. This is why Grace Ashcroft's total inexperience is her greatest gameplay asset. Because she lacks combat training, the game can just eschew mechanics that would feel frustrating or unrealistic for a character like Chris Redfield. This includes significant weapon sway, fumbled reloading animations, and the possibility of tripping while running in a state of high panic. These mechanics make basic actions feel intense and high stakes. You aren't just pressing a button to reload. You are watching Grace desperately try to jam a magazine into a handgun while a monster is screaming in the next room. This inexperience turns every encounter into a desperate struggle for survival. Grace's inexperience also allows for a tangible growth arc that the player can feel through the mechanics. At the start of the game, her aim is shaky and her movements are slow. However, as the player completes objectives and survives encounters, her aim stabilizes and her reload speed slightly increases. This provides a sense of character progression that is rooted in the narrative rather than a standard RPG stat screen. The player feels themselves learning the game alongside Grace. By the end of the campaign, Grace is still not a super soldier, but she is a hardened survivor. This growth makes the final act of the game feel much more earned. You have taken a timid analyst and turned her into someone who can survive the ruins of Raccoon City through sheer will and experience. The clinical reality of this inexperience is the friction it creates in the gameplay loop. In the Super Soldier era, the friction was minimal. The characters moved and fought with absolute precision. With Grace, the friction is a constant factor. You have to account for her shaking hands and her slower movement speed when planning your route. This forces the player to be more methodical and careful. You can't just run into a room and expect to react to everything in time. You have to scout ahead and use Grace's technical gear to ensure the path is clear. Her inexperience is the requiem for the player's confidence, a reminder that in a biohazard zone, being unprepared is the default state of the human condition. Furthermore, her inexperience allows the game to return to the clock tower or haunting ground era of horror, where the protagonist's primary goal is to find a way to escape or hide, rather than to fight. This de-escalation of combat makes the discovery of a safe room or a hidden passage feel like a massive victory. Grace's lack of skills justifies the focus on atmosphere and exploration over action and spectacle. It allows the 30th anniversary title to be a slow-burn horror experience that prioritizes the psychological toll of the city. Grace is not a weapon. She is a witness, and her inexperience is the lens through which the player sees the true horror of the aftermath. She proves that you don't need a high-tier military background to be a compelling and effective lead in a world defined by biological failure. Part 11. The Personal Stakes, Wrenwood Hotel and Closure. The Wrenwood Hotel in Resident Evil Requiem serves as the new Spencer Mansion, a contained and claustrophobic setting that is steeped in history and biological rot. For Grace Ashcroft, this location is not just a mission site. It is a graveyard that holds the secrets of her mother's final days. This personal stake raises the narrative tension far above a standard save-the-world plot. Grace is not there to stop a global virus. She is there to find closure and to perform a forensic autopsy on the life and death of Alyssa Ashcroft. This makes every room she explores and every file she finds a piece of an emotional puzzle. The closure she seeks is deeply personal, turning the game into a psychological journey through the ruins of her own family history. The Wrenwood Hotel is designed to be a character in itself, mirroring the internal state of Grace's grief and fear. The overgrown vines, the flooded corridors, and the shifting layouts create a sense of environmental paranoia that is perfectly suited for a civilian protagonist. Grace's high intellect allows her to see the hotel as a data node that can be decrypted, but her low resilience makes every corner a potential death trap. The personal stakes are reflected in the ghost lore found throughout the hotel, audio logs and notes left by Alyssa that provide Grace with a voice from the past. This makes the 30th anniversary feel like a dialogue between generations, as the daughter follows the footsteps of the mother to uncover a truth that has been buried for 30 years. The clinical reality of these personal stakes is the weight of history. Grace is walking through the remains of a world that died before she was born, but that death is the reason for her current trauma. This creates a temporal friction in the storytelling. You are exploring the aftermath of 1998 in the year 2028, and the Requiem is for the lives that were lost in the gap. The Wrenwood Hotel is the heart of the sterilization strategy, the place where the biological and the political conspiracies intersect. For Grace, finding out why her mother died here is the only way she can move forward with her own life. This emotional drive is what pushes her through the terror, making her survival a victory of the human spirit over the cold logic of the bioweapon industry. The personal stakes of the Wrenwood Hotel allow the game to explore the theme of generational trauma. Grace is the post-Raccoon generation, dealing with the biological mess that her parents' generation left behind. Her search for closure is a reclamation of her own future from the shadow of the past. This makes Resident Evil Requiem a very adult and sober category of horror. It isn't about the thrill of the hunt, it is about the sorrow of the aftermath. The hotel is a monument to 30 years of human failure, and Grace is the analyst who has come to perform the final audit. Her personal stakes are the soul of the game, providing a human anchor for the massive global conspiracy of the Elpis project and the corrupted BSAA. Part 12, Grace's crafting system using infected blood. One of the most innovative and clinical gameplay additions in Resident Evil Requiem is Grace Ashcroft's specialized infected blood crafting system. Because she is an FBI technical analyst with a background in forensics, she does not rely on finding standard boxes of ammunition to survive the Wrenwood Hotel. Instead, she utilizes her forensics kit to harvest samples of infected blood and tissue from the biological organic weapons she encounters. This creates a high-stakes risk versus reward system. To gather the materials needed to craft poisons, antidotes, and specialized technical tools, Grace must get dangerously close to the very creatures that can kill her. This turns her scientific background into a core gameplay loop, where the business of survival is a methodical and biological process. The infected blood system allows Grace to synthesize solutions to the environmental and biological obstacles she faces. For example, she can craft pheromone distractions that lure monsters into traps, or corrosive antidotes that can dissolve organic barriers in the hotel. This shifts the focus from destruction to analysis. You aren't just killing a monster, you are harvesting it to provide the tools for your own survival. This aligns perfectly with Grace's intelligence over combat philosophy. She doesn't have the brawn to punch through a door, so she must use her forensic skills to find a biological key. This clinical approach to crafting makes the 30th anniversary feel like a new era of survival horror, where the player is an active participant in the biological reality of the world. The reality of this crafting system is the physical danger involved in the harvesting process. The player must perform a minigame or a technical skill check to harvest the blood correctly, while the monster is incapacitated but still potentially lethal. If Grace fumbles the extraction, she risks becoming infected or triggering a panic state that makes her vulnerable to other threats. This adds a layer of friction to the resource management that was absent in previous games. You aren't just picking up an item, you are performing a procedure. This turns every item drop into a potential boss fight for your nerves. It turns the infected blood into the most valuable currency in the game, forcing the player to weigh the risk of a close encounter against the reward of a much-needed antidote. The crafting system allows for a customizable survival experience. Depending on which samples Grace harvests, she can specialize in different categories of forensic tactics. She can focus on stealth and distraction by crafting pheromones, or tactical sabotage by crafting corrosive chemicals to destroy enemy equipment. This adds a layer of agency to the civilian protagonist role. Grace may be physically weak, but her biological mastery over the environment makes her a formidable opponent in her own right. She is the alchemist of the apocalypse, a character who proves that in a world defined by biological war, the person who understands the blood is the person who controls the future. This crafting system is the definitive Requiem for the standard ammo box, providing a clinical and immersive way to engage with the horrors of the aftermath. Part 13. How Grace connects new fans to classic lore. The character of Grace Ashcroft serves as the most effective narrative bridge Capcom has designed to integrate 30 years of disparate history into a single cohesive experience. For new fans who entered the series during the RE Engine era or through the recent remakes, the lore of the 1990s can often feel like an overwhelming collection of names, dates, and convoluted corporate backstories. Grace solves this problem by acting as an audience surrogate who is learning the clinical truth of the world alongside the player. Because her professional role as an FBI technical analyst involves digging through digital archives and performing historical audits, the game has a built-in excuse to declassify the past without it feeling like a forced exposition dump. As she recovers files at the Wrenwood Hotel, she is essentially teaching the player the history of Umbrella, the Raccoon City incident, and the rise of the global bioweapon market. Through her mother, Alyssa Ashcroft, Grace provides a direct emotional tether to the original 1998 roots of the series. For a new player in 2026, the Outbreak games might be unknown cult classics, but Grace's personal journey of finding her mother's case files makes that history feel immediate and relevant. She connects the classic era of civilian survival to the modern era of institutionalized bioterrorism. This connection ensures that the 30th anniversary doesn't just feel like a nostalgia trip for the old guard, but a necessary exploration of the series' DNA for the next generation. Grace is the lens through which the player sees the original sin of Umbrella being refined into the systemic control of the mid-2020s. She proves that the events of 30 years ago are not just history. They are the foundation of the current nightmare. The clinical reality of this connection is the documentation of the aftermath. Grace is trained to look at the world through the evidence it leaves behind. When she finds a 1998-era computer in the RPD station, or a series of handwritten notes in the hotel, her technical skills allow her to reconstruct the context of those items. This provides a multi-layered storytelling approach, where the player is constantly moving between the present-day 2028 investigation and the 1998 tragedy. This is a requiem for the old lore, showing how the viral outbreaks of the past have mutated into the political and biological conspiracies of the future. Grace makes the lore feel adult and sober by focusing on the forensic details of the disaster rather than just the theatrical monsters. Furthermore, Grace's connection to classic lore allows Capcom to reward long-term fans with deep-cut references that actually matter to the plot. Mentioning the connections or the E-series research data is not just an Easter egg when Grace is the one auditing the files to survive. She validates the entire timeline by showing that every incident, from the Spencer Mansion to the Baker House, was a stepping stone toward the current sterilization strategy. This makes the franchise feel like a single, massive, and terrifyingly plausible history of biological war. Grace is the librarian of the apocalypse, the character who ensures that the lessons of the past are not forgotten in the chaos of the present. Her role as a connector is her greatest contribution to the franchise's identity, providing a sense of cohesion that has been missing for years. Part 14. The Passing of the Torch. From Stars to New Generation. The 30th anniversary of Resident Evil represents a biological and narrative passing of the torch that the franchise has needed for over a decade. The original Stars generation, including characters like Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Barry Burton, are now in their 50s. While they remain iconic and powerful, their role in the story has naturally shifted from active survivors to veteran commanders. Grace Ashcroft represents the post-Raccoon generation, the youth who grew up in a world where the Raccoon City incident was a historical fact of life rather than a sudden disaster. Her taking the lead in Resident Evil Requiem signals that the series is finally ready to let the old guard transition into supporting or mentor roles, while the next generation deals with the biological mess they left behind. This transition is essential for the long-term health of the series. If the same 4 characters continue to be the only ones capable of stopping biological threats, the world of Resident Evil begins to feel small and stagnant. Grace brings a fresh, institutional perspective to the war. She is not a soldier fighting on a battlefield. She is an analyst fighting in a server room and a laboratory. This shift reflects how the threat of bioterrorism has evolved from local outbreaks into global systems. The new generation needs to be intellectually equipped to deal with a world where the enemies are no longer just monsters, but the very organizations meant to protect us. Grace is the template for this new hero, someone who is physically vulnerable, but technologically and intellectually superior to the systems of control. The clinical reality of this passing of the torch is the thematic weight of legacy. Grace is not just a new character. She is the living consequence of the decisions made by the generation that came before her. The trauma she carries from her mother's death is a direct result of the war that Chris and Jill have been fighting since 1996. By taking up the Ashcroft investigation, she is performing a requiem for the survivors, showing that the fight for the truth continues even as the original heroes grow tired. This generational shift allows the veterans to be portrayed with more dignity and depth, acting as the tactical anchors, while the new leads provide the horror and discovery. It ensures that the franchise remains relevant for another 30 years by embracing the natural passage of time. Furthermore, the passing of the torch to a character like Grace allows the series to explore new categories of gameplay. The super soldier model has been pushed to its absolute limit. There are only so many times a character can punch a boulder before it becomes a parody. Grace resets the power curve, making the fear of death a credible mechanic again. This is a requiem for the action era, a move back toward the survival roots, but with a modern, high-tech edge. Grace represents the future of the series, a future where the heroes are investigators, whistleblowers, and technical experts who must dismantle the biohazard world through forensics and intelligence. The old guard has held the line for 30 years. Now it is time for Grace to find the truth that can finally end the war. Part 15. Grace as the bridge between Outbreak and modern Resident Evil. For decades, the fans of the Resident Evil Outbreak series have felt as though their favorite corner of the lore was being ignored by the mainline entries. Making the protagonist of Resident Evil Requiem the daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft is a definitive move to validate that specific timeline and integrate it into the modern RE engine era. Grace serves as the bridge between the ordinary citizen perspective of the 1990s and the professional analyst perspective of the 2020s. This integration suggests that the ordinary people who survived the streets of Raccoon City were just as essential to the story as the elite police units. It elevates the Outbreak legacy from a spin-off curiosity to a foundational part of the franchise's biological and social history. By using the Ashcroft lineage, Capcom is validating the collective trauma of the Raccoon City incident. Grace's journey through the Wrenwood Hotel is a mission to finish what a civilian reporter started 30 years ago. This bridges the gap between the analog horror of the past, tape recorders, handwritten notes, and physical lockpicks, and the digital horror of the present, encrypted servers, neural links, and cyber forensics. It shows that while the technology of bioterrorism has evolved, the human drive to expose it remains the same. Grace is the requiem for the forgotten survivors, the ones who didn't have special training or government backing, but fought to survive anyway. Making her the lead validates the idea that anyone can be a hero in a biohazard zone if they have the intellect and the will to find the truth. The clinical reality of this bridge is the lore consistency it provides. It allows the game to reference specific Outbreak locations and events, such as the Jay's Bar incident or the Raccoon City University experiments, as established facts that Grace is auditing. This creates a much more dense and rewarding world for the long-term fans without alienating the newcomers. It suggests a world that is lived in, where the events of 1998 have had lasting consequences on the people and the institutions of the mid-2020s. Grace is the character who finally connects the small stories of the citizens to the big stories of the global conspiracy. She proves that in the world of Resident Evil, every witness matters, and every file recovered is a blow against the systems of control. Furthermore, Grace being the bridge allows for a return to the civilians in a combat zone dynamic that made Outbreak so terrifying. Unlike Leon or Chris, Grace has more in common with the waitress Cindy or the security guard Kevin than she does with a super agent. Her fragility and her shy personality remind the player of the original horror of being a normal person in a city full of monsters. This is a requiem for the human element of the series. By bridging the gap between Outbreak and modern RE, Capcom is centering the 30th anniversary on the resilience of the human spirit rather than the lethality of the military machine. Grace is the definitive lead for this celebration, a character who honors the past by ensuring its stories are finally told in the light of the 21st century. Part 16, Why Grace Works for the 30th Anniversary. The 30th anniversary of Resident Evil in 2026 is a massive milestone that requires a protagonist who can simultaneously honor the past while looking toward the future. Grace Ashcroft is the perfect vessel for this objective. Her lineage to Alyssa Ashcroft connects her to the 1998 roots of the series, providing the nostalgia and the emotional weight required for an anniversary title. However, her professional role as an FBI technical analyst and her focus on information warfare modernizes the gameplay for the year 2028. She is a legacy character who carries none of the narrative baggage of having appeared in 10 previous games. This allows Capcom to tell a fresh and unpredictable story, while still grounding it in the series' most iconic location, which is Raccoon City. Grace works for the anniversary because she represents the final audit of the franchise history. As she explores the Wrenwood Hotel and the ruins of the RPD, she is literally performing a forensic autopsy on 30 years of biological warfare. Her professional skill set is a meta-commentary on the series itself. She is the one digging through the files, connecting the dots, and uncovering the clinical truth that fans have been debating for decades. This makes the gameplay feel like a celebration of the series' lore. Every file you find and every puzzle you solve with Grace is a piece of the 30-year puzzle being put into place. She is the historian of the biohazard world, the character who provides the sense of closure and continuity that a milestone title demands. The clinical reality of why she works is her accessibility. For a series that has become as complex as Resident Evil, a new protagonist provides a clean entry point for the new generation of fans. Grace is learning the secrets of the sterilization strategy and the BSAA corruption alongside the player. This removes the barrier of entry while still rewarding the veterans with deep cuts to the Outbreak era. She is a requiem for the convoluted lore, a character who simplifies the massive global conspiracy by focusing on her personal quest for closure. She proves that even after 30 years, the most effective horror stories are the ones that are deeply personal and grounded in the vulnerability of the human condition. Furthermore, Grace works because she represents the evolution of the hero. In 1996, the hero was a STARS member with a handgun. In 2026, the hero is an analyst with a laptop and a forensics kit. This shift reflects how the real world has changed and how our fears have evolved from physical monsters to digital and institutional systems of control. Grace is the hero for the era of the aftermath, a character who proves that the most powerful weapon against a 30-year-old conspiracy is the will to know. Her inclusion in the 30th anniversary is a statement of intent by Capcom, showing that the next decade of the franchise will be defined by intellectual agency and forensic horror. Grace is the requiem for the old world, a character who is ready to lead the franchise into a new and terrifying reality. Part 17. The Future. Can Grace carry the franchise forward? If Resident Evil Requiem is the critical and commercial success that Capcom expects, Grace Ashcroft offers a brand new template for the future of the franchise, which is the Investigator. For years, the series has struggled to maintain the balance between horror and action, often leaning too far into the latter as the protagonists become too powerful. Grace solves this problem by centering the gameplay on forensic horror and cyber forensics. This allows for a future where the series focuses on solving the biological crimes of the world, rather than just fighting the resulting wars. Grace could lead a new team of non-military specialists, scientists, analysts, and whistleblowers who deal with the systemic root of the biohazard threat. This would be a profound shift in the series' identity, moving from tactical shooter to information thriller. The clinical reality of Grace carrying the franchise forward is the longevity of her character type. Unlike the super soldiers who eventually hit a ceiling of power and age, an investigator can evolve and grow through the complexities of the law. Grace's skill set allows for a wide variety of gameplay scenarios, from stealth infiltrations in high-tech corporate bunkers to forensic audits in abandoned laboratories. She provides a grounded anchor for the series, ensuring that the horror remains focused on the human experience of survival. By moving the focus away from global warfare, Grace allows the series to return to the intimate and claustrophobic dread that made the RE Engine era so successful. She is the blueprint for a more sophisticated and adult category of survival horror. This future also allows for a more collaborative lore, where the old guard acts as the command tier, while Grace and her team are the active investigative tier. This would resolve the super soldier problem permanently, as the veterans would only be called in for the most extreme combat situations, while the bulk of the game is handled through the lens of a vulnerable protagonist. It creates a sustainable narrative cycle that can last for another 30 years. Grace is a requiem for the one-man army, a character who proves that the most effective way to fight a global conspiracy is through a network of information and intelligence. She represents a future where the truth is the only win condition that matters, and knowledge is the only currency that has value in the aftermath. Furthermore, the investigator model allows the series to explore more relevant themes such as institutional corruption, digital surveillance, and biological ethics. These are the real-world horrors of the 2020s, and Grace is the perfect protagonist to navigate them. She can carry the franchise forward because she is a character of the now, a technical expert who is physically fragile but intellectually formidable. Her potential to lead a new era of Resident Evil is immense, as she provides a way to maintain the horror while expanding the scope of the storytelling. Grace is the spark that could ignite a second revitalization of the series, proving that the most terrifying nightmares are the ones that can be audited, analyzed, and finally declassified. Part 18, Final Verdict. Grace's impact on Resident Evil's identity. The final verdict on Grace Ashcroft is that she successfully shifts the identity of Resident Evil away from superheroes fighting monsters and back toward people surviving nightmares. Her impact on the franchise is a fundamental reintroduction of the fear of death, the importance of lineage, and the idea that in a world defined by biological war, knowledge is the only weapon that doesn't run out of ammo. Grace is the requiem for the action era of the mid-2000s, a clinical and necessary correction that restores the soul of survival horror for the 30th anniversary. She proves that the series does not need bigger monsters or more explosions to be more impactful. It just needs a protagonist who can actually be killed by the environment they are exploring. Grace's legacy will be her role as the clinical auditor of the franchise history. She has successfully integrated 30 years of lore into a single, personal story of closure and survival. Her impact on the series' identity is seen in the move toward forensic horror, where the player is an active participant in uncovering the truth, rather than just a witness to the carnage. She has validated the Outbreak era and provided a logical path forward for the post-Raccoon generation. Grace is the character who proves that the ordinary citizen perspective is the most powerful lens for survival horror, as it reminds the player of their own mortality. She is the definitive lead for the year 2028, a character who honors the legends of the past while carving out a new and terrifying reality for the future. The clinical reality of her impact is the systemic shift in gameplay design. By centering the experience on a technical analyst, Capcom has opened up new possibilities for puzzles, investigation, and environmental interaction that were previously impossible with a super soldier lead. Grace has changed the power curve of the series, making the stealth and avoidance loop as satisfying as the combat and destruction loop. She has proved that Resident Evil is at its best when it focuses on the human element, the fear, the trauma, and the intellectual resolve of a person caught in an impossible situation. Grace is the requiem for the old guard, a character who has successfully taken the torch and used it to shine a light on the darkest corners of the biohazard world. Ultimately, Grace Ashcroft is the savior of the Resident Evil identity. She has brought the series back to its roots of vulnerability and dread, while providing a high-tech and modern edge that keeps it relevant for the 21st century. Her journey through the Wrenwood Hotel is more than just a game. It is a historical audit of a 30-year-old mistake. She is the protagonist who finally lay the ghosts of 1998 to rest, providing the closure that both the characters and the fans have been seeking for decades. Grace's impact is permanent, a biological and narrative shift that ensures Resident Evil will continue to be the king of survival horror for another 30 years. She is the requiem for the old world and the architect of the new nightmare.